The Legend of Zelda series has one of the most confusing timelines in all of pop culture. My goal today is to deconstruct it, see where we started and how we got to where we are, where one game, splits into 3 different timelines. So let's jump right into it and deconstruct the Legend of Zelda timeline. Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Ryan here from Game Essays, and as you saw in the intro, we are deconstructing the Legend of Zelda timeline. So right now you see this lonely one game here, the original Legend of Zelda, because we are going through this game by game to show you how the timeline started and how we got to where we are now, where, you know, just to give you a little sneak peek, here is what the official timeline looks like in all of its glory. You can see me zooming in and out here. Yes, we have 3 branching timelines. How the heck did we get here? Well, that's my goal today, is to show you. So we're going to start here with the original Legend of Zelda. So this game is pretty simple, right? Ganon is evil. He has taken the Triforce. I believe he has the Triforce of Power. And Zelda is trying to prevent him from getting the Triforce of Wisdom, so she splits it into 8 pieces, and Link has to go and reconstruct it, defeat Ganon, and there you go. That's pretty much the story in a nutshell. It's been a while since I played it, but hey, those are the, you know, the basic details. Of course, Adventure of Link, we get a direct sequel. So you can see here immediately, I'm going to be shuffling these around a lot, by the way, so I might be recentering them just so that they look nicer, but whatever, disregard it. So immediately we have a direct sequel, right? So Zelda 1, Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. Link then is on a quest to save another Princess Zelda who fell asleep many years ago, and, you know, Link's on a second adventure. So it's the same Link from the first game. So when people are like, oh, why do people even build a timeline? Well, the first 2 games are, you know, one after another, a congruent story. So you can see how this is something, it's not like these games were complete standalone, totally separate stories from the start. You can already see right from the get-go, these games always had some sort of connection going on. Then we get A Link to the Past. A Link to the Past. This is a game that's going to be moving around a lot, but A Link to the Past, its backstory is really the thing that is going to cause a lot of confusion. But when you boot up A Link to the Past and you start a new game, you get the backstory of what's known as the Imprisoning War, and we're going to be circling back to that a lot. But the placement of A Link to the Past, for the most part, has commonly always been placed before these 2 games. Now, there was a thing at one point called the Miyamoto order, where on the spot Miyamoto was asked this question about the placements of all the Zelda games, how they fit together, and I believe he put A Link to the Past like towards, you know, after these 2 games, but all points, you know, everything points to the direction that A Link to the Past happens before these 2 games. The back of the box literally says play as like the predecessors to the original Link and Zelda. So, you know, in these games, the original Hyrule Kingdom doesn't really exist in the NES games, but in A Link to the Past, it's kind of like, oh, this is a time where Hyrule Kingdom was thriving and whatnot. But anyway, the big thing about A Link to the Past is the Imprisoning War, which essentially was Ganondorf accesses the Sacred Realm, but is then sealed in the Sacred Realm when he acquires the Triforce. And he essentially turns the Sacred Realm, which is the area where the Triforce is kept, and that is then turned into the Dark World. It's this mirror world to Hyrule, and essentially the Sacred Realm stays open, so all these people who are after the Triforce, which is a very powerful thing, having a piece of the Triforce gives you a lot of power, and if you have all 3 pieces, you can basically make any wish you want. So it's like the Dragon Balls from Dragon Ball Z. So obviously, people know about this. They're all for it. So all these people flood into the Sacred Realm, and they end up turning, because the Dark World reflecting their the greedy personalities, whatever, they all turn into these monsters, and that's all the monsters you see in A Link to the Past, basically. But anyway, so that seal imprisoning war is the lead up to A Link to the Past, because when you play A Link to the Past, Ganon is in the Dark World, and then in the end, you fight and defeat him in the Dark World. You acquire the Triforce, and you make your wish at the end. So that is the story of A Link to the Past, and it's going to come up again and again and again. We got Link's Awakening. I used the Switch cover because it's prettier, but Link's Awakening is going to go right here because Link's Awakening is a side adventure for the A Link to the Past Link. He goes to Koholint Island. It ends up being a dream, but a lot of things kind of point to this being the side quest, if you will, for the Link from A Link to the Past. You even see at the end of the game there's like a nightmare version of Ganon from A Link to the Past. So if Link's basically stuck in this dream and it's like some of his subconscious is there, it would make sense that he would see Ganon from A Link to the Past. Now, the placement of this and the games we get to a little bit later, the Oracle games, do kind of the placement has changed a little bit, but I'll get to that when I get to that. But essentially, this was pretty much where we were at this time. I don't think anyone would really debate this back when Link's Awakening came out. Then we get Ocarina of Time, and things don't get quite crazy yet. But Ocarina of Time, at this point, at 1998, if people were piecing the games together, this would be how people would have pieced them together, except for maybe this not being a Switch cover, but whatever. Now, Ocarina of Time, and there's even quotes from developers where Ocarina of Time was supposed to be that imprisoning war I was talking about, right? Where Ganon is sealed in the Sacred Realm, and then, like I said, all these guys flood in or whatever. But the key thing here is, in the backstory to A Link to the Past, Ganon has all 3 pieces of the Triforce. At the end of Ocarina of Time, Ganon only has the Triforce of Power. And also, there's no real talk of like a hero defeating... there's no talk of a hero defeating Ganon or anything. It's just the 7 sages, or it's retconned in the GBA version of A Link to the Past, but the 7 sages seal Ganon in the Sacred Realm. But most people just kind of ignored the inconsistencies and just said, okay, they took a little bit of a license so that they can make a game out of it. So at this point in time, most people assumed, although not 100% confirmed, but alluded to heavily, that Ocarina of Time was the Seal War that they were talking about. Imprisoning War, Seal War, they're used interchangeably, but anyway. Hopefully I'm not getting too confusing. I'm trying to go as slow as possible. But this was basically, backstory to A Link to the Past is what we're playing in Ocarina of Time. That was what was accepted. Majora's Mask comes in. It doesn't really shake things up too much, right? The events of Ocarina of Time happen, but Majora's Mask is just the side story for the Link from Ocarina of Time. Now, if you notice, at this point in time, it's kind of cool, right? We have the original Link in his side story. You got A Link to the Past Link in his side story. And then you have Ocarina of Time Link in his side story. So we were following a pretty strict pattern here. But again, this was basically what people thought of as the timeline at this point in time. Majora's Mask doesn't really add anything. It's just when Link becomes a child again, which will be very important soon to come. He then goes on his adventure. And then, is there a split timeline? I'm going to get to that very quickly. But we're kind of like, okay, well, how does A Link to the Past fit in if, like, what happens at the end of Ocarina of Time kind of reverses things? The Oracle games come out. I use this just to show both of them. They happen in whichever order you play them. But for a while, the Oracle games were interchangeable between the, A Link to the Past. A lot of people would place them in whatever order. It's clear that the Oracle games take place in that close to that A Link to the Past era, based on just where the Triforce is at the end of A Link to the Past. But it's not super clear if Oracle Link is the same Link from A Link to the Past. But it's very clear that Link's Awakening and A Link to the Past Link are the same. But one thing that happens in the Oracle games that makes me think it is a different Link than A Link to the Past is that when Zelda shows up in the Oracle games, it's like Link is meeting her for the first time. But we already know that the A Link to the Past Link knows Zelda. So for that reason, I think most people had it like this, but the reason some people go with the Oracle games being before is just because at the end of the Oracle games, Link leaves on a boat. And at the beginning of Link's Awakening, Link is on a boat. That's literally the big reason why people put them in reverse order. But, as you can see in this little document here, at the end of the day, Link's Awakening goes before the Oracle games. So I'll leave it like this for now. Okay, so after that, Four Swords comes out. So it's just this little side game on the GBA version of A Link to the Past. And for whatever reason, the developers say that this takes place, it's just old as hell, and it takes place before Ocarina of Time. It doesn't really impact anything, so I won't spend too much time on it. But they just said that we're thinking of it as the earliest game. There's Vati in it. They say this old villain named Vati has been resurrected. He kind of comes into play later. But they just say, hey, this is even older than Ocarina of Time. Here's where the problem happens. The Wind Waker. The Wind Waker is the problem child. Great game, but it is the problem child in all of this. So up until this point, we assumed that the true follow-up to Ocarina of Time was A Link to the Past. As we said, right? The imprisoning war that they're talking about, with some, minor discrepancies, is what Ocarina of Time was. Well, now we have a follow-up in the Wind Waker that's heavily talking about the end of Ocarina of Time. It's heavily alluding to Ganon being defeated and all that. So, and the Earth's flooded, all of this. So how the heck, we have two follow-ups to A Link to the Past, right? So what the heck's going on? Now, there's quotes from Anuma, who is the lead developer of the Zelda games, and he says, we think of Ocarina as having kind of two endings. Not necessarily like, oh, you can unlock another ending, but no. At the end of Ocarina of Time, Link is an adult, and he defeats Ganon. Ganon is then sealed away by the sages, and that is what is known as the adult timeline. Link is an adult. We're 7 years in the future from when the game started, but Zelda is then going to send Link back in time to his childhood. So Link is now gone from this timeline, but this timeline is still happening, right? Zelda is still there as an adult, and everyone else in the fallout of Ganon being sealed away, they're all still there. Just Link has been sent back. And then, where Link is sent back in his childhood, where stuff like Majora's Mask is taking place, that's all still happening too, right? And that's just, now Link has the knowledge of what he did as an adult, and he can use that to his advantage. So at this time, I'm actually not 100% sure where people were really placing the games. People might have had it like this, where we have one split with Wind Waker happening. I'm not too sure where like the community would stand at this point in time, but that I think this is where maybe people would have speculated. It's kind of weird. You have Wind Waker just kind of on its own here, but a split is happening. Like I said, this is probably the one era where I'm not 100% sure what common, people might have still had it as a linear timeline. Four Swords Adventures, kind of a game no one really thinks about, but for a long time was a big piece of what people debated. So, as I said, the Ocarina of Time and the whole Seal world, imprisoning war, is just this big topic that keeps getting continuously debated. The events of Four Swords Adventures are kind of also similar to the imprisoning war that was described as the backstory to A Link to the Past. So a lot of people started thinking, oh, well, maybe because there's those discrepancies with Ocarina being the imprisoning war, is Four Swords Adventures the real imprisoning war? So that kind of is what puts us to some people having a timeline like this, with this being the imprisoning war. And there's even quotes from some of the people who worked on Four Swords Adventures, and there's some, I think, where people data mine the game and they were like, oh, there was actually a lot of hints that this was what they were trying to do, to basically fix A Link to the Past by making Four Swords Adventures the Seal War. Because there's actually a new Ganon, and it says he gets like a trident of power, and obviously A Link to the Past Ganon has a trident. So that is where people were like, oh, maybe this is the imprisoning war. Apparently, Miyamoto stepped in with this while they were trying to do this imprisoning war thing for Four Swords Adventures, and he nixed the whole thing and didn't let them do it. But there was enough left over for people to still speculate that maybe this is the imprisoning war. Like I said, this imprisoning war thing is going to come up time and time again. Next, we get the Minish Cap. And the Minish Cap basically is the backstory for this Vati guy I was talking about, and also makes it feel like things like the Triforce aren't as well known. It also shows Link getting his hat for the first time, so people thought, oh, this clearly has to be the first game because Link has his hat and all the other ones. Ended up being meaningless, but at the time, it was a big deal. So this is where we were at this point in time. Twilight Princess comes out. And finally, Twilight Princess is really it's the equivalent to Wind Waker on the other side of the timeline, right? So where people thought, okay, Wind Waker is the adult side, well, and Enuma, I think, also confirms this, Twilight Princess is going to be the child side of that split I was talking about. Again, to reiterate, at the end of Ocarina of Time, there's Ganon is defeated, Link is an adult, and then after that, Zelda sends him back in time, and that timeline still goes on, and that's where the Wind Waker happens. No hero shows up, the earth gets flooded, and then the events of the Wind Waker take place. But on the child side, Link comes back with all that knowledge. He has his, he talks with Zelda, says what's going on. Yo, this guy's gonna tear shit down. Like, let's get on this. After that, they're able to get to Ganon in time. Majora's Mask happens. We don't really know what happens to Ocarina Link. But then you see a cutscene of Ganondorf getting executed in Twilight Princess. So Twilight Princess, these two are kind of like the mirrors of each side of the timeline. And then I think a lot of people were here at this point in time. We get Phantom Hourglass coming out. That clearly is the sequel to Wind Waker. Spirit Tracks comes out next, and that's clearly kind of like a sequel from there. They're searching for a new land in Phantom Hourglass after Link and Tetra have defeated Ganon at the end of the game. And then in Spirit Tracks, a new Hyrule is founded. We're kind of a couple generations later, and we see, events take place from there. And then, so for a long time, this, when I really came into the scene of timeline speculation, this was one of the more popular timelines that people had put together. Was, people would say, okay, Four Swords Adventures is the Seal War, and that is that's the pre-story to A Link to the Past. So this is where a lot of people were at. There were some people at the time who, were ahead of their time that had A Link to the Past, off over here in its own place. So these pioneers, I remember them back in the Zelda universe websites and all that. There were some people ahead of their time. Because when Skyward Sword came out, also saying it's the earliest game in the timeline, we got a taste of essentially an earlier version of this document, which has Skyward Sword at the earliest, Minish Cap, Four Swords, Ocarina, and we go into the splits. So now I got to do a lot of shuffling here. But we get to basically this point of... This one's going to take a little bit more time, but excuse me while I shuffle these around. We get the 3 timelines, and I will explain in just a moment. There's so many caves. This is how ridiculous. I'm resizing this one. Anyway, so with Skyward Sword, the reason this all comes together is not just because, Skyward Sword says it's the earliest game or whatever, but Skyward Sword, with it came what is known as Hyrule Historia. And Hyrule Historia gave us a timeline. We actually got a timeline in a document. For the longest time, Nintendo was like, oh, we have a timeline, but they kept it secret. Well, they eventually were just like, screw it, we're going to release it. And when they released it, they had these 2 games flipped, Link's Awakening and Oracle games. But we know since then, I showed you basically the latest version of the timeline. That's essentially where it stands. So this is where we were. And what is this third split? How does this third split exist? We know the adult timeline. We know the child timeline. I've explained them twice already in this video. But why do we have this third one? Well, this whole imprisoning war thing that I keep coming back to, and it's pretty much the crux of all the confusion with the timeline. The imprisoning war, like I said, it always had those discrepancies with Ocarina of Time. So to basically rectify that discrepancy, they had to come up with more of a what-if timeline where basically Link dies against Ganon, and the sages still have to, Link dies against Ganon, Ganon acquires the full Triforce, and then is sealed in the Sacred Realm by the sages. And that helps clear up those discrepancies that we have with the imprisoning war in Ocarina of Time. And that's why the third split exists. Basically, the third split exists because they tried to make the backstory to A Link to the Past in Ocarina, but they can't just have Link lose at the end of Ocarina, so they changed things a little bit. But because they changed it, it screws up the timeline of events. So they had to kind of create this what-if scenario. So now the original games are not, like, they're canon, obviously, but they exist in this what-if scenario that we've never technically even been shown. But that is where we are. And really, it's the only way to have it, I can see from their perspective, unless they create a new game, it's the only way to have it work, all because of a mistake they made of trying to create a backstory and then tweaking a few things. And that's how we got to where we were. A Link Between Worlds, it follows suit in this timeline. It goes, it's very close to A Link to the Past, but because these other 2 games happen so shortly after A Link to the Past, it actually takes place, over at the end here. We also got Triforce Heroes, which then takes place after the after A Link Between Worlds. So these two games, they didn't really shake things up at all in terms of timeline placement. Pretty much everyone really knew where they went when they came out, and I think Nintendo also kind of went along with it. So this is now where we basically are with the confirmed timeline until, of course, finally we get Breath of the Wild to come out. And now Breath of the Wild, they pretty much put it at the end of everything, but it still isn't like confirmed. They want people to speculate again. They kind of want to bring the fun back. Because I will say, prior to Skyward Sword, even though things were a mess and most people thought there was only 2 splits and things like that, it was a lot of fun to, to speculate. And I'd love to even kind of do a video specifically on the fun. And a lot of that was lost once we got the document out. And, Hyrule Historia, and then eventually the encyclopedia, which gave us like the correct one. But maybe they wanted to recapture that, because Breath of the Wild, most people say, okay, let's just say it's the inevitable ending of all 3, where, if a million years pass, we always get to this point, which is Breath of the Wild. No matter what happened in between, you give a million years in between, we'll get there. But then other people think, okay, there's clues towards all 3 of them. So we don't know for sure where Breath of the Wild takes place, but we know it's pretty far into the future if it's in any of these timelines. So this is still up for debate here, but we know it's at the very end no matter where it is. So at the present moment, I think most people just speculate, hey, you go a million years in the future in any of these timelines, you're gonna end up at Breath of the Wild, and it doesn't matter. And it's their way to hopefully like clean things up and have a more linear timeline from there on out. But that's pretty much what I wanted to cover today. And I hope it wasn't too confusing. Please let me know if you have any questions. But I wanted to take everyone kind of through the years, where we were with these timelines. The imprisoning war just ruining really everything. That was the whole crux of everything being so confusing for so long. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I've got a few other Zelda videos up. I have a full review on Phantom Hourglass. I'm going to be going through every single game in the series, reviewing it. It's going to take a long time, but Phantom Hourglass is out now. I've also got some dungeon tier lists as well, so feel free to throw any questions at me. I love this stuff. I love Zelda, and please, check out other videos, like and subscribe if you enjoyed this, and I'll see you guys next time.